America is nothing without the heroes who risk life and limb fighting for her abroad. So why is the Veterans Affairs Department trying to kill them at home? I'm Hayden Ludwig, and you're watching Restoration Spotlight. Our guest today is Daniel Gade, a West Point graduate, retired U.S. Army lieutenant colonel, and two-time recipient of the Purple Heart for his heroism in the Iraq War. He's also one of the most scathing critics of the failed VA, infamous for giving our vets one more opportunity to die for their country even after their tours of duty come to a close. In 2020, Daniel ran for U.S. Senate in the state we both call home, Virginia, and since 2022 has served as a commissioner in the Virginia Department of Veterans Services. Daniel, we're so grateful to have you on the show.
Absolutely. It's a joy to be here. Thank you.
So I want to start with your work exposing the corruption and neglect within the Veterans Affairs Department. You've written a powerful book on the subject, Wounding Warriors, where you point out that the VA's disability model, and this is a quote, churns out diagnoses of disabilities and applies bandages of cash in lieu of the rehabilitative care veterans deserve, and that at a cost of $105 billion annually. And this is a system that keeps people sick, not makes them well. Now, Daniel, obviously this is a massive topic, so let's start by giving us the 30,000-foot view of what's fundamentally wrong with the system.
Yeah, so I think first it's really important to sort of establish like who I am and what my credibility is to talk about this. So I was wounded twice in combat. I was wounded in November 2004 and again in January 2005. And in 2005, I ended up losing my right leg at the hip. So I spent the next year in the hospital, basically inpatient and outpatient. And I observed this problem closely, which is that there are these organizations who would come to wounded veterans and say, hey, we're going to get you paid. We're going to make sure you get paid. And it was always about money. It was never about true rehabilitation, not just physical rehabilitation, but also social rehabilitation and economic rehabilitation. And so I saw that, and I just was so troubled by it. But I had an assignment to go teach at West Point, and so as part of that, I went to get a master's degree right after, a year to the day after I got wounded. I started my master's degree at University of Georgia, later followed by a PhD in this same topic. And what I discovered, what I learned in my master's degree, I was then able to apply when I went to be the White House domestic policy advisor on veterans policy in the Bush administration. So I was an associate director of the White House Domestic Policy Council. So I went from having this sort of user level view of the wounded warrior experience, if you will, to the very highest level review of the wounded warrior experience. And just what you said is exactly what I discovered, which is that the VA, due to political pressure primarily, over the last really about 60 years, has gone further and further down the path of paying veterans for things that if you were to, in a regular civilian context, there's just no disability program that would compensate for some of these things. And it's all political pressure. It's veterans groups trying to get as much money as they can from the system for their members, and that's normal in politics. But in this case, what it does is it traps veterans in a life that is essentially in an unimproved condition. It pays veterans to be sick, and then we as a society look at our veteran population and we wonder why we have so many sick veterans. We wonder why so many veterans are not doing well.
Yes.
And the reason, the high level reason for that is because we pay them not to do well. And it's a crazy problem because if you think about it from the opposite perspective or from a sort of normative perspective, you would imagine that somebody who enters the service, maybe their life trajectory would have been here. And then they get hurt or wounded or something, and their new life trajectory is maybe a little lower than the course they were on had they not served. And a sane disability policy or a sane VA policy regime would do its best to close the gap between where somebody is and where they would have been but for their service. Right. And so what does that look like? It looks like when people leave the military, everybody leaves the military, whether it's at the end of one enlistment, whether it's at the end of half an enlistment when you get hurt, maybe it's at the end of a illustrious 35-year career. Either way, everybody has to leave the military. And what we ought to be doing when somebody leaves the military is doing everything we can to close the gap between where they are and where they would have been otherwise. And so to me, that looks like job placement. It looks like reskill, upskill, and transition assistance. In some cases, it looks like cash payments to people. It looks like disability payments to those who are truly seriously disabled as a consequence of their service. But what we have now is a system that awards disability compensation before rehabilitation is even attempted in some cases, and often before rehabilitation has had the time it needs to fully establish in somebody's life and really make their life better. And it's a moral outrage in a lot of ways, because what we all want, I think, as citizens, and I'm not in the military anymore. Just a regular citizen now. But what we all want for our military people, our veterans, is the best possible life that they can have in light of their service. As a result of their service, we owe people an obligation as a society to help them thrive. And what we're doing right now is not helping them thrive. What we're doing right now is trapping them in a position that they are worse off and sicker.
So somebody who may not have any experience with the military, don't have any family in it, don't touch the VA, for instance, this might sound a lot like the problems that beset our social safety nets, right? It's almost a welfare problem. It's a system that should be designed to get you out of it. That would be a sign of success. We don't have people in it because we've helped them and funnel them out. Instead, it becomes a system that's designed to bring you in and keep you in, because you're a hamster spinning the wheels here. You're not really getting what you need, and it's enormously expensive. But a lot of people aren't paying attention to this unless they themselves are a victim of this, or they've got a family member or a close friend here. So for somebody who's not in the know here, give us just an illustration of why this is such a big problem. Why this is affecting the servicemen and women who've been injured in the line of duty here and now are not getting proper attention, but the country as a whole isn't paying attention to them.
Yeah, so I'll give you just a very easy example. Actually, is in the case of mental health disorders, and there's a variety of mental health disorders that are sort of common to humanity, right? If you've had a traumatic experience, sometimes that can result in short or long term, hypervigilance and all of that stuff, and some of that stuff gets packaged into this diagnosis we call PTSD. And what the VA does is they have a lot of programs to try to help people with PTSD. But what those programs are is essentially like if you were to drive your car with one foot on the brake and one foot on the gas, all you do is create a big cloud of smoke and destroy your car, right?
Right.
But in the case of the VA, what happens is the healthcare people are the gas. They're trying to make things better. They're trying to help veterans have a better life. They're trying to rehabilitate them emotionally and mentally so that they can get on with their family, get on with their community, get on with their jobs, all of those things. But what happens is, in order to access the disability benefits, you have to stay sick. And so a lot of veterans are trapped in this place where they say, well, I'm getting paid like $4,000 a month tax-free to be sick. And if I get better, the fear is, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my disability payments. And so there's all kinds of studies about this that show that once people begin to receive disability compensation in the VA in particular, they stop seeking treatment. There's a huge drop off, like an 80% drop off in treatment seeking behavior after
Wow.
they've been awarded their disability compensation. And so now you have this case where the disability compensation is the brake on people's lives. And while the healthcare people are trying to get people to a new destination, a higher, better destination, the other foot is stuck on the brake and they're paid to stay in that sick condition. So that's in the case of PTSD. And that's, one of those things that you commonly hear about veterans suffering with mental health illnesses and all of this
Yes.
stuff. And a lot of that could be ameliorated or could be, really even cured by long-term intensive healthcare. But as a result of the disability system, people are afraid or unwilling to engage in the necessary hard work of getting better. And so they end up in this really trapped, unimproved condition. And that's just like one of many, many kinds of things here. The other problem is that there are a whole lot of things that the VA pays money for that are either not caused by service at all. So it might be caused by genetics, it might be caused by lifestyle, it might be caused by personal choice. But the VA pays for those things anyway. I'll give you some examples of that. There's a recent bill passed with respect to toxic exposures, is what it's called, and it's called the PACT Act. And the PACT Act pays, in particular, I'll talk about Vietnam veterans just briefly, These are people, the youngest Vietnam veterans now are in their early 70s, the youngest ones. And the PACT Act says if you were in Vietnam at all and you have type 2 diabetes, the presumption is that that type 2 diabetes is caused by, not just related to, but caused by your service, and so we'll pay you compensation for diabetes. But what diabetes, especially adult onset diabetes is a lifestyle condition. It's related to being too fat. It's related to
Right.
eating too much sugar. And as a result, you end up with this situation where people are able to do, and I know this is a Christian podcast, so I can use, sort of a Genesis example here. Um, People are able to shift the blame from their own behavior and point at somebody else and say, no, it's the government's fault. It's everybody else's fault that I have type 2 diabetes. It's not my lifestyle choices that are causing that. And to
Hmm.
me, I always use the example of when Adam and Eve are in the garden and Eve, takes the fruit off the tree and she eats it, and then God comes down and she offers it to her husband, he eats it. But God comes down and says, "Hey, what is going on here? What are you guys doing?" Heavily paraphrasing Genesis,
I don't think type 2
but what
diabetes is
Adam
involved in that story, but yes, I get you.
no, not at all. But what Adam does is what is very common in sort of human, what we all want to do, which is
Mm,
point to an external cause when it's our own fault. And in Adam's
yes.
case, it was that he wasn't leading his family very well, and he was allowing his wife to, or he was there while she was making poor choices, and he didn't call her on it. And
Mm,
then he says to God, he says, no, it's the woman's fault. It's somebody else's fault that I sinned. It's not my fault. Now, having type 2 diabetes or being overweight is not sinful. But the point is that there's this powerful incentive to point the finger at somebody else instead of at our own responsibility. And then there are just some things in the VA system that are completely absurd. For example, the VA pays compensation for, we talked about this before, but for tinnitus or tinnitus, however you want to say it, which is, ringing in the ears. And that can be caused by service. It can be caused by loud noises, but there's no test for it. There's no blood test for it. There's no hearing test can't determine it. The only test is the doctor or the person says to the veteran, "Hey, do your ears ring?" And the veteran says, "Absolutely, my ears ring horribly." And for that, you can get a 10% disability all by itself.
wow.
And so that's the number one thing that veterans file disability compensation for. Millions of claims total around that, and it's completely unverifiable. And it's something that, even if it was verifiable, yeah, it's a condition, but it's not a disability. It's something that a lot of people live with. I have ringing in the ears. It's probably from using loud equipment and doing a lot of hunting and all that. I don't believe it's due to my service. And so I chose, when I was filing, when I was leaving the military and I was going through this system, I chose not to file for any of that, even though I could have, and I could have done it easily and without anybody questioning it.
And I think another example from your
So
book, if I
really, we
remember
have
right, I think another example from your book, if I remember right, is flat feet being something you could file for. And the irony too, you mentioned this idea of personal responsibility, and of course, the opposite of that is dependency. Like not like a child to his father or something, but this kind of government dependency of somebody else will rule my life for me because I won't allow myself to confront my own sins, my own weaknesses, my own poor decisions, and the
right.
consequences thereof. And it's very ironic because the U.S. military has a culture of be all you can be in the Army, right?
Hmm.
Of
Hmm.
be the best man that you can possibly be, and that means confronting your weakness, hammering that out like a piece of iron, right, sharpening other iron. And
That's
yet,
right.
when we kick them out, you enter into what we already recognize as like a welfare mentality of no, 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 I
It's
need to be taken care of. I can't take care of myself anymore.
That's right. That's right. It's exactly a dependency problem. And the thing that makes it different. So, those of us who are old enough remember in the '90s there's a major welfare reform thing that had to do with work requirements before you can get welfare and things like that. And the people who were targeted by welfare reform, if you will, the sort of stereotypical person with some a single mom living in an urban setting and with a bunch of children and what is going on, how is the system encouraging these people to be sick, but welfare reform was wildly successful. Work requirements really help and all that stuff. The difference between those people that were successful reform occurred and the veteran system where no meaningful reform has ever occurred is that the veteran lobby is very, 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 very powerful. The VFW and the DAV and the American Legion and Wounded Warrior Project and on and on and on, all these groups go to Congress and they say, look at me, I'm wrapping myself in a flag. And because I've wrapped myself in the flag and because I served in the military at one point, you owe me. I wrote a check. It just turns my stomach, this phrase, like I wrote a check to the government for any amount up to including my life. I wrote them a blank check. And so now you owe me. And, I always go back to JFK's exhortation, if you will, to the American people, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And that's how we are as military people. That's what military people do every day. Those people who are serving the military are putting aside their free speech rights and their ability to go wherever they want, whenever they want, and their ability to say some things and all of that. They put that aside for the greater good. And that is totally praiseworthy. But what happens then is once they separate, then they get trapped in this system that is the opposite of that in fact encourages them to not ask what they can do for their country, but how much their country will give back to them every month for the rest of their lives. And it is a welfare system. It's horrific. It's really bothersome. And the worst part isn't the money. And by the way, you said 105 billion because that's the number that's in my book. But the book was published in October of 2021, several years ago. And now the number is like 160 or 170 billion a year paid in disability compensation. And again, when you think in your head, when you think of the word disabled veteran, you're thinking of a guy in a wheelchair. You're thinking of
Lieutenant Dan.
A woman
Right,
with severe.
exactly.
Yeah, you're thinking of Lieutenant Dan. And by the way, I know Gary Sinise. I love him. He's a great human being. He's very funny. But anyway, Gary Sinise is a great guy. But the whole Lieutenant Dan image is what the normal, what your everyday civilian sort of thinks of disabled veterans. They don't think of somebody with tinnitus. They don't think of somebody with flat feet. They don't think of somebody with adult onset diabetes because they're 70 pounds overweight. And they also don't think, that one of the most absurd, and I think Congress is actually going to finally do something about this, I hope. There's a 50% disability rating associated with having a positive pressure breathing machine to prevent sleep apnea. So the CPAP, the mask that probably most of our dads wear when, some of our brothers and, maybe some of the people watching this have a CPAP. And it's like, okay, that's an important piece of healthcare equipment. Sleep apnea is an important problem and you ought to take care of it. But is it a disability? No. And especially when you think about the fact that losing a single eye all by itself is a 30% disability. Losing a leg below the knee is a 40% disability. But using a CPAP at night to sleep is a 50% disability. That's insane. It's just a completely it's a morally problematic system. It's a morally corrupt system. And for me, honestly, I get a lot of fire for this. I get a lot of hate for saying to veterans, hey, the government is not your dad. The government is not the government's not your uncle. The government's not your dad. You are responsible for your outcomes once you leave the military. And yes, we owe people a hand up. We owe them rehabilitation. We owe them medical care if they're for service caused conditions. But what we don't owe is a lifetime of disability payments for conditions that are common to humanity, that are oftentimes caused by genetics or aging or lifestyle. And really, there's no moral difference to me between taking a 50% disability payment for something that is not the fault of the government at all and going next door to your neighbor's house when she's not there and rooting through her purse and taking money out. It's the same thing.
Yeah, right.
Because the government doesn't have money. Your fellow citizens pay taxes and it's their money and the government is supposed to use it for positive purposes, national defense and roads and on and on. There's a lot of things that the government should be doing. But the idea of paying people to be sick is abhorrent morally. It's bad financially, and it's bad for these veterans because they get trapped. They get converted by this system from being these positive, forward-looking, thoughtful, motivated, all these things, to being somebody who is essentially not that much different from I'll use the old offensive 90s term, a welfare queen. It converts people from positive, mission-oriented, self-sacrificial into people who are walking around with their hands out, asking for their fellow citizens to take care of them. And we can do better. We can do better as a society for our veterans. We can honor our veterans by helping them thrive and not paying them to be sick.
Yeah, and dependency never begets gratitude. It always begets a sense of entitlement over time on any human being,
That's
no matter how
100% right.
virtuous they
Yes.
are. Yeah, it's
Yes,
interesting what you're
absolutely.
describing in political science terms. That's a classic iron triangle situation where you've got
It is.
the left is generally anti-military, so wouldn't really be inclined to be sympathetic. The right is reflexively patriotic and righteously so, but are going to be very wooed by the argument of nothing's too good for our veterans, for our servicemen and women, and how dare you, Daniel
Yeah,
Gade, want to take away the money
that's right.
from our wounded warriors and all of this. And it's a very easy way for a U.S. congressman or senator to say, "Hey, I stand with the troops because
It's
I
virtue
got a
signaling. Yeah.
$20 billion increase to the VA, and you're the only guy staying on Capitol Hill saying." There's a problem, and we got to do something about this. So, what is the path forward here? If you're advising President Trump, for instance, and I do want to get to your time in our state, Virginia, in a moment here, but if you had this opportunity to lay out the problem, Mr. President, here's what we can do about this. Who's the constituency you go to? How do you lay out a battle plan to get to these kinds of reforms that make the VA into the organization that it's supposed to be? That, frankly, a lot of people believe it is right now.
Yeah. I would say there's two sort of separate constituencies that need to be engaged here. I'll say the first one is veterans themselves. As veterans, I think we owe it to each other. I had a friend call me the other day, a little while ago, and he said, "Hey, I'm getting out of the army. What disabilities should I file for?" And this guy was a successful surgeon. He's now a very high level surgeon at a different place. He'd been a surgeon in the military for like 25 years. Like he's a successful guy. And I just asked him, I said, "Well, but are you disabled?" He goes, "No, well, no, not at all. I've just been a surgeon my whole life, so I do a lot of standing and sometimes my legs hurt." And I'm like, "Well, but isn't that what every surgeon has?" And he's like, "Well, yeah, totally." And I was like, "Well, then why apply for disability at all? Why would you make a moral claim for something that in your heart is not moral?"
Yes.
And so as veterans, I think we ought to have that discussion about morality a lot more often. I had a podcast with some guys after the Senate hearing on October 30th, I think it was. Some of these guys came after me and online and whatever, and I said, "Hey, look, I'll just have this conversation with you." And I had this conversation, and they said, "Well, are you trying to shame veterans? Are you trying to?" And at the time, I didn't answer the question exactly how I wanted, because I think there is room actually for shame to come back. Because if you're taking disability payments and you're not disabled, you should be ashamed by that. That is a
That's right.
shameful
Yeah.
act.
You're taking
I
resources
think
from
that
somebody who really needs it.
that's right. And I think veterans need to hear that message loud and clear. The other thing that, the rest of the conversation, I think there are about 350 million Americans, 330 million of them are not veterans. But I would like those people to know what exactly is happening in the veteran community. And what is happening in the veteran community is deeply disruptive to veterans. It's bad for them. And so the more people that understand really how bad that system is, how exploitive it is, how disabling it is, the more people that understand that, the better off. And it's funny. I've had a lot of conversations on Capitol Hill over the years, not just in the last couple of months, but really over the years. I've had a lot of conversations about this, and everybody, left, right, center, behind closed doors, every member of Congress I've ever spoken to about this is like, "Yeah, you're right. It's a disaster of a system," but they're unwilling to say that publicly.
If
And
that's not
so that kind
Capitol
of
Hill
public pressure,
politics, by the way, that's
it is.
exactly it. I mean, with every issue,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
please.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you could go to things like abortion, where it seems like both sides are more interested, instead of solving some of these problems, they're more interested in having the problem so they can campaign.
Yes, that's
And
right.
in the case of veterans, I think it's just a case of it's cowardice on Capitol Hill. It's money grubbing by quite a lot of veterans, not all. I'm not saying all, but I'm saying that the system encourages that kind of behavior, and it's deeply disruptive.
That is fascinating. I want to change gears a little bit. Talk about we're both Virginians. You've served since 2022 on the Virginia Department of Veteran Services under Governor Glenn Youngkin. Tell us about that experience, because obviously military affairs is a huge component of living in Virginia. We have a lot of veterans. We have a lot of active duty U.S. military right now, a lot of military bases. So describe your time on that commission and what reforms you're able to get passed. Hopefully, if any. I mean, knowing what you're up
Yeah.
against here, this is a massive problem.
Yeah, so I served as the commissioner of the Department of Veteran Services, and it's not like there's three or four commissioners. There's one commissioner, and that person is in charge of the entire Department of Veteran Services, which is about 1,200 people. You know, four nursing homes, a whole bunch of people who help do benefits, some people who do suicide prevention, um, some people who do education and rehabilitation and that kind of stuff. So, unfortunately, in that role, I had a kind of a bully pulpit, and so I was able to go to these conferences when I would get invited as a speaker, and I would say, "Hey, let's take a step back from the question of how much money we can shovel into people's pockets, and instead have a discussion about what we ought to be doing. What have normative discussions. A normative discussion is one where we're discussing what ought to be and not trying to do what is right now. And so, I was able to use my bully pulpit on some of that stuff. But the truth is, most of that policy is federal policy. It's not state policy. The state departments of veteran services, every state has one. Those are really sort of functional in the sense that they help process claims and all of that. But what they're not doing is really changing policy, because those policies are really made at the federal level. And so I've done quite a lot of advocacy on this. I've written op-eds, everything from New York Times and Wall Street Journal, and the book, Wounding Warriors, which is available on Amazon. We might be sold out on Amazon, actually, but it's on Audible, and I did the Audible book myself. It's a fascinating book that really is a very approachable way to understand this problem through the eyes of a whole bunch of veterans. It's not my story. It's not about me at all. I'm not even in the book. It's about a couple of other veterans and a lot of other veterans. And we talk to clinicians, and we talk to veterans, and we talk to policymakers, and on and on. And it's a really a careful, thorough treatment of this problem. And I would just encourage people, if they're feeling like, oh my gosh, this is a big problem, I should know more about it, or if they're mad at me and they think I hate veterans or something, fine, buy a copy of the book, read it, and I think you'll see that the argument is much more nuanced than, I'm for veterans or I'm against veterans. I'm for them. I want them to thrive. I want them to have better lives, and I want our country to be enriched by them. But right now, those, when that sword is used, oftentimes, the sword gets dinged or it gets rusty or whatever. But what we do as a society is we take those veterans, those former swords, and we throw them in the corner, and we let them, and they're sort of feeling sorry for themselves, rather than reforming them into productive plows for society.
Absolutely. I heartily recommend the book. Final question as we close out here. So you did run for U.S. Senate back in 2020 against Democrat Mark Warner. As you know, his seat
Yep.
is open in 2026. I believe at the time of recording that it's unclear whether he's personally running for re-election. Either way, the military is going to be a big issue in the Virginia Senate race in 2026. What are your thoughts on that? What are your predictions? What issues do you think Republicans should be cornering in this issue, maybe is the better question.
Yeah, honestly, what I would say I know there are several veterans who are Republicans running against Mark Warner. I haven't seen the full list, and people aren't going to start getting on the ballot and getting ballot access and declaring for the primary for another month. Is really when all of that starts in earnest in January. So it's not clear exactly what the Republican side of that's going to be, and it's probable. I think it's probable that Mark Warner is going to run again. He and I actually have a warm relationship. I think we ran a respectful campaign. We disagree sharply on a whole lot of things, but I think he is a gentleman generally. But I also will say that I think there's an opportunity for people to say, well, hang on a second. Do we really want somebody who just votes with their party every single time, every step of the way?
Right.
Or do we want diverse opinions and diverse sort of people who are willing to say to their party, like, hey, the party's wrong on this. I'm going to break with the party on that. Mark has never broken with the Democrat Party. He stays with the Democrat Party all the time. Virginia's a blue state, though. And so it's going to be a pretty tough uphill road for anybody to unseat Warner on that. And honestly, the veterans issues, there are a lot of major issues in America right now. And the veterans one is a big one to me. It happens to be the one that I'm expert in and have a personal connection to. But there are a whole lot of things that a Republican who's running against Mark Warner ought to be talking about. Veterans might be one of them, but there's a whole lot of other things like use of force, and abortion is a huge one, and what kind of judges we want. And senators have an incredibly important role, and this particular policy area is just one item on there.
Absolutely. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for your time and for your service to our country. It's been a real treasure talking with you.
Absolutely, it's a joy, and I'd love to come on any old time you want to talk about this. And if you want to have a more fulsome political conversation, let's do this again in May or June when it looks like the field is set and we can really see who's who in the zoo.
Yeah, I would love to do that. Again, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
I'm Hayden Ludwig, and this is Restoration Spotlight, a project of Restoration News, your source of headline-smashing investigative journalism for the America First movement. Check us out at restoration-news.com. Until next time, stay vigilant and trust in God.